So welcome to the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast. Usually you hear Daniel Yang's voice at this time, but I had an opportune moment. I love an opportune moment, a kairos moment, serendipitous, all the different words I can pull from the thesaurus on a moment's notice. So we actually host twice a year a private meeting with the heads of evangelism of denominations, and church planting, and ministry. And so I just literally came from that meeting. And while we were there, the closing talk was done by a friend of mine who just did an amazing, amazing job. And so I said, hey, can you come to the studio and I want to record a podcast with you specifically on reaching the next generation? Because I recognize that we talk about reaching next generation, we can categorize that in different ways. And my guest actually serves and engages in those different ways. But I want you to stay with me because we've got really a fascinating conversation. Talks about his life, which is a fascinating story. He's written a book on it, but also too engaging the next generation in particular, and I hope powerful ways. So our guest today is actually Greg Stier. He's a champion for unleashing this generation with the gospel. And Greg, so glad you're here. You were able to hang out with us. And let me tell more about you though before we say hello, and then you can say hello. You can say hello.
Hello.
There you go. There you go. You're so timid. You're so timid. Not at all. Dare to share. And the key word is dare. You're not a subtle man. Dare to share. And you founded and lead Dare to Share. We've interacted in several ways. I actually had the privilege of speaking to some of your key leaders and supporters. I'm a big Greg Stier Dare to Share fan. But your talk today was just awesome. And I want you to talk a little bit about why you are so focused on engaging next generation, because our audience is all church leaders. You know, someone might be saying, well, I got a youth pastor or a college minister for that, but why should we all care?
Well, if we're really serious about reaching our cities for Christ, we need to go to the demographic that's the most open to the gospel, and that's 18 years old and younger. And I was a pastor. I was a church planter. Yep. 10 years.
Which is like a special club that you're in.
Yeah. You know what? I'm so glad. It was great, and I love ministering to adults and preaching it, expositing the word, and challenging them to share their faith and live their faith. But all the while, my whole life was transformed because of youth ministry was on fire and shook our city for Christ. My whole family came to Christ as a result. And I knew, man, if we're really serious about reaching my city, we got to mobilize teenagers for the cause. And so I was actually, right up until the Columbine High School shooting happened on April 20th, 1999, I was planning on pastoring and doing Dare to Share at the same time for the rest of my life.
Yeah. And everyone, the words Columbine, regrettably, school shootings are but that was that shook the world. Yeah. And it shook your life. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I knew a lot of the kids at Columbine High School. My wife is a public school teacher in the same district. And, it was whatever reason, I think Columbine, there were shootings before that. John and I, my friend, were talking about that on the way here. There's shootings after that, but it became the terrible yardstick by which every other school shooting would be measured for whatever reason. And because I knew a lot of the kids, it shook me up. And my question was, where were all the Christian kids to reach out to the shooters? What would have happened differently? What could have happened differently if they were reached for Christ? And so I ended up resigning from the church to mobilize teenagers full-time because I feel like there's, 350,000 churches in the United States. If they're serious about reaching their cities, let's go to the demographic that's the most open. Yep. Let's mobilize these young people, and then those students become ambassadors of hope on their campuses.
So, and I want to talk specifically about that. You quoted some people like Whitfield and Edwards and some others about the next generation that I think is real helpful. But the Columbine thing becomes a key part of your story. But you've actually written a book called The Unlikely Fighter, which tells some of the story. It came out in 21. I had the privilege of endorsing it, so I read it a little earlier. But it kind of tells your story. Yeah. So tell a little bit about your story, and then I want to get back to the next generation question.
So I was raised in the inner city of Denver. Every city's got a city.
I got to tell you, when you're inner city Denver, it doesn't sound really scary to me.
It doesn't.
But, okay.
But every city's got a city within the city. Yep. Lincoln, Nebraska's got a city within the city. And ours was a small patch of area in Denver called North Denver, which was the highest crime rate area. It was mafia controlled. Yep. My uncles were nicknamed the Crazy Brothers by the mafia, which when the mafia thinks your family's dysfunctional, it's not good. 3 of my uncles were competitive bodybuilders. I don't know what happened to me. My whole family was big.
You showed you shared with us in the conference. You showed like arm wrestling.
Yeah, my Uncle
And
Jack.
I felt like a little bit like I don't want to arm wrestle that person.
No,
and
no.
so you're not an arm wrestler.
No,
we
I'm
can
not.
not arm
No, I'm
wrestle.
not.
Okay, all right.
No.
Okay.
But so my whole family was like this, and very far from God, very violent, in and out of jail, and a hillbilly preacher, nicknamed Yankee for whatever reason, on a dare reached my toughest uncle with the gospel. My Uncle Jack trusted Christ. He brought 250 people out to Yankee's church in 1 month.
Crazy.
My Uncle Bob came to Christ in the back of a squad car after he beat a guy to death, and he just called out to God.
Wow.
My whole family eventually got involved in Yankee's ministry. Well, Yankee was a pastor, but he believed the fastest way to reach a city was through the youth. So we had 300 adults in our church, but we had 800 teenagers in our youth ministry.
That's crazy.
And he trained us, and he equipped us, and he mobilized us.
So you
with the
started
gospel.
with that idea. So how old were you when you came to Christ?
Well, I was 8 years old.
Yeah. So your lost family, though.
Yep.
And then Yankee comes in. Just as a Yankee, I just want to affirm Yankee being the good guy in the story is unusual.
Yeah, that's right.
And so Yankee comes in. Your family comes to faith in Christ.
Yeah.
And student ministry central there.
Yeah, and so I start sneaking into the youth group at 11
Yeah.
years of age, and immediately I'm trained, equipped, and mobilized. They train us in systematic theology and evangelism and apologetics. They take us out sharing the gospel. Well, the youth group was that big because he trained students to reach students.
Crazy.
So my point of reference for youth ministry was we're on fire for God. We're responsible to reach our city.
Love that.
And the adults are there to support and encourage and align us for that. And when I got out and started looking around at other youth ministries, I started realizing, oh my goodness.
It's not the thing.
No, they're
Nope.
just entertaining these kids and throwing them.
You're getting me youth ministry. I want you to get to youth ministry, but I need a little more about, because you wrote a whole book.
Yeah.
And I want to encourage people to get it. Again, it's Unlikely Fighter. And what is it? The subtitle is The Story of...
How a fatherless street kid overcame violence, chaos, and confusion to become a radical Christ follower.
You need to talk to your publisher about a shorter subtitle, but I'm tracking with you. So, and who is the publisher, by the way?
Tyndale.
Tyndale. Oh, great. I love Tyndale. I write with Tyndale. Okay. So what else is in the because again, I want to encourage people to pick up Unlikely Fighter. What else is in there? But then I want to get to the next generation stuff. You just want to get to the next generation stuff, and I'm trying to talk a little about your book.
Sure.
So let me work with you here.
So my ma, who I desperately love, she was a single mom, married several times. When she found out she was pregnant with me, she met my biological father at a party. They partied. She got pregnant. He found out. He got transferred. She
Just
drove.
so the kids know, partied means something's different.
Yeah, partied is code for
naughtiness.
naughtiness. And she drove from Denver to Boston to have an illegal abortion.
Wow.
And changed her mind last minute, came back. She would look at me and start bursting in tears. I remember from the time I was a little kid, she would just cry.
Wow.
And she had a rage. When I was 5 years old, I saw a guy that she had married pulled up in a car. He had left us. And I yelled inside, Mommy, Mommy, one of my daddies is here. And she goes, where's the bat? And I had a little plastic yellow bat. I go, here, Mommy. She wanted the Louisville Slugger. She reaches behind the door, goes out, cigarette hanging out of her mouth, destroys his car, takes out his windshield, his headlights, the side mirror, taunting him to get out of the car. Well, he made the mistake of getting out.
Wow.
Well, she's got 5 street fighting brothers that are all afraid of her. She took the dude apart. And I'll never forget, she's walking back up. I'm asking 3 questions. I'm saying 3 things in my mind. Number 1, how did that cigarette stay in her mouth the whole time?
That's a skill that people
That
have.
is a skill.
That's not our generation. It's the prior generation.
Oh, yeah, she was good at it.
Yeah.
2 is I will never disobey my mom.
Yeah, for sure.
And thirdly is why is my mom so angry?
Wow.
And my grandma told me when I was 12, the whole story about me almost being aborted.
Right.
She had a shame-fueled rage. So when Yankee trained me to share the gospel when I was 12 years old, the first person on my mind was my mom.
Yep.
And I began to share Christ with her because I was equipped to share Christ. It took 3 years.
Wow.
And finally, when I was 15 years old, I had the privilege of leading my mom to Christ.
That's amazing.
And while she was smoking a cigarette,
Yeah.
she put her faith in Christ, and I discipled my mom.
Wow. 15 years old.
15,
That's
and I
crazy.
wasn't an exceptional kid. I was a trained
Well, I don't
student.
disagree. You're exceptional,
Yeah.
but we'll talk about that in a minute.
But-
So, and you tell these stories and more. Again,
Yeah.
the book here is Unlikely Fighter. The full subtitle: The Story of How a Fatherless Street Kid Overcame Violence, Chaos, and Confusion to Become a Radical Christ Follower. It's really a fascinating read. And it does weave in your passion for student ministry. You've written lots of things in and around. This is not your only book. You can find these all at the show notes for the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast. But when as a matter of fact, we joke about last time we were on the radio together, somehow Mark Middleberg, you and I got in a conversation because I co-wrote a book called Viral Churches with Warren Bird. Warren, love you. And then Mark Middleberg chimed in somehow and said, yeah, I wrote a book, because viral churches doesn't sound so great after the last few years.
Yep.
And Mark Middleberg said, well, I wrote Contagious Christian. And then you said, I wrote Outbreak. And so we have learned our lesson about book titles to the world. So, okay, but your passion for the next generation becomes so clear and evident, and something seems to have shifted. So again, even here we were talking about, I'm like, I'm afraid some people will turn away. I don't want to listen to student ministry conversation.
Yeah.
But, Donna is my wife. We met each other at I started a Bible study in my high school. And she came late wearing her very cute softball uniform. Sorry, got a little distracted there.
That's right.
And left early to go softball practice. And I said, I got to meet that girl. Well, when I got to know her, she had, through her church and her student ministry, youth group called them, she had actually reached like 9 or 10 other girls for the good news of the gospel. And I needed to know this girl.
Yeah.
And for me, I was in an Episcopal church plant at the time. It's a little teeny church, maybe 30 people. There were 2 people in the student ministry, 3 eventually. And, the church is larger now. So we didn't have anything like that. But immediately, my life was changed because of a guy who discipled me named Steve, who was a volunteer youth director who didn't know anything. But he said, at one point, something like, we should read a book on discipleship. So he told us to do this. So we go to this Christian bookstore and we buy this book with discipleship title called The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which turns out probably not the best first book for a teenager to read, but changed my life.
Yeah.
And in this case, both these situations were, for Donna and me, our student ministry years were transformative. And yet it seems that a lot of churches have kind of made that into a 4-year holding tank with pizza.
Oh my goodness.
And again, if we're going to engage that generation. So keeping in mind that most of our listeners are not student pastors, cast a vision why the whole church needs to care.
Well, I really do believe the change happens when you're young.
Yeah.
Primarily. Something like 80.
We can show the stats.
Yeah. Something like 80% of the people that come to Christ do it by the time they're age of 18. If we can mobilize teenagers, we're not having to break up the hard
Not
concrete.
just evangelize, but mobilize teenagers.
Yeah, mobilize.
Yeah.
And so, when you work with adults, you need a jackhammer to kind of break up the hard concrete.
Yeah.
I used to be in construction. With teenagers, you just pour the wet cement.
Yeah.
And with children. And so I think that the thing is that it's not just youth ministry, it's the right kind of youth ministry.
Yeah.
And so there's a mentality that I think we're stuck in the 80s of this come and see. You have a pizza party, have fun, come and bring your friends out, come to camp, come to retreat. And I believe in come and see.
I feel judged because with the 2 years I was a youth pastor, the worst youth pastor ever, you just described my student ministry. So I would later learn differently, but that's sort of what I knew.
Well, and that's part of youth ministry. And I'm not saying get rid of that, but we got to combine.
1986, baby. I was making ice cream floats out of gutters.
Yes.
And lock-ins. Do we do lock-ins anymore? Please tell me they don't do lock-ins.
They still do
anymore.
lock-ins, yeah.
Sweet mother of pearl. I'm not ready for
help
okay.
us.
Okay.
But when you combine come and see with go and rescue,
right.
I think that's where the difference is. It's a nitrogen and glycerin. You're still inviting kids to come to youth group and experience God, but you're mobilizing teenagers. If you look, in the words of my friend Chris Selby, if your teenager goes to a public school, they're a federally funded missionary for 8 hours a day. They have the opportunity. And, with adults, we have to constantly tell them, build bridges, build relationships, and make connections. If you tell a teenager to build bridges to their unreached friends, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. Their whole life is building bridges. Yeah. They just got to be equipped to cross them.
Okay, so the first time you reached out to me, you were down, and you wanted me to come downtown to see you or something. You were at Moody Bible Institute. And so I met you and what's
Debbie Brissina.
Debbie's great. And we had lunch there. You were doing a camp. I think I was there for something else, but we connected. And you said something to me that actually brought me back to my conversion. I never told you this until right now on the Stetzer ChurchLeaders Podcast. Because you said what we tell kids is, or what we tell people is, when you become a Christian, one of the first things you do is tell somebody else. And I processed that. And I remembered that when I was a brand new believer, I remember I came to Christ on a Friday night, and the person said to me, the person doing the thing prayed with me and said, now the first thing I want you to do is I want you to go tell somebody. And I didn't know the words. I didn't know anything. It was this charismatic Episcopal youth camp that my mom made me go to because I got in trouble. I heard the gospel there, not a church kid, didn't grow up in church. And so I went home, told a member, first thing I asked was an adult member of my family. And I said, I came home and said, are you saved? Because that's the word I heard. That's all I knew.
Yeah.
And he said, saved from what? And I said, I don't know, but I just was.
That's bad.
And you should be too. And really, it helps cement my faith. I was already public.
Yeah.
So, baptism is going public.
That's
Think of this,
exactly right.
But I was public before that.
And that when in James 2, when it says, was not our father Abraham considered righteous when he was willing to offer Isaac on the altar? His faith and his actions working together. His faith was matured, made complete by what he was willing to do. Because he put what meant most to him on the altar. What means most to a teenager is how their friends perceive them. And when they evangelize, they're putting that social equity on the altar, and they're saying, you know what, I'm willing to sacrifice this for the sake of the gospel. And they mature as a result. I think
I just want to tell you the phrase social equity was not what I was thinking as a teenager, but I like it. I mean, really, it does, just as baptism is that public identification in our tradition. I think for me, I literally went away from that lunch with you, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was so thoughtful, and I didn't even realize it until decades later.
Well, if you do look at baptism as that first evangelism experience, because in the early church they did that in public, and Romans 10, the NIV text note says that phrase "Jesus is Lord" was the baptismal confession. So if you think about it, it's saying you confess you believe in your heart, you're justified. You confess with your mouth, you're saved. Maybe that saved is not the justification. Maybe that's a sanctification. So that when you declare Jesus is Lord,
I think if I agree with that,
moment,
you said that very fast.
Yeah. So
okay.
So if you look in the NIV text notes, it says that phrase "Jesus is Lord" was the baptismal confession.
Right. Sure.
So you believe in your heart, you're justified. Right. You declare with your mouth, you're saved. Perhaps that is talking about more about the sanctification side, because you did a public declaration in front of strangers and friends that I believe Jesus is the way, the truth, and life. He's the one way.
Sure.
That's a microcosm of evangelism right there. Going public with your
Makes
faith.
perfect sense. Okay, so you wrote another book called Gospelize, and the whole theme is Gospelize Your Youth Ministry.
Yep.
I read that, and because again, just to be clear, I was in college for 2 years. I was a part-time youth pastor. I didn't know what I was doing. Nobody told me what to do. I just loved Jesus, and I was a college student, so that makes you a youth pastor in some context.
There you go.
I don't think it's a good thing. I'm just saying that's what it was.
At least in an Episcopalian charismatic
Yeah,
church.
exactly. Actually, that was not. I was Baptist by then.
Okay.
So yeah. So when you look at a lot of student ministries today, I think a lot of people are just like, I'm just trying to get people to come.
Yeah.
Let alone helping them be gospel witnesses.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of our student ministry is trying to witness, trying to get people to walk with the Lord.
Yeah.
Is there a chicken? Is there an egg? Is an egg a chicken? How does it all work?
Well, what we did in Gospelize is that we did a massive research project. We found 7 values that were common to every youth ministry that was seeing 25% new conversion growth per year or more. And I would venture to say this is probably true church-wide, even though these are youth ministry focused. Cross-checked it with the book of Acts. What we discovered is youth ministries that were thriving with new disciples made and multiplied. Intercessory prayer was a huge priority. They prayed for the lost. They interceded for the lost. And we spend more time in announcements than intercessory prayer for the lost. 1 Timothy 2, when Paul is telling Timothy, here's how you program the church at Ephesus. First of all, prayers, thanksgivings, intercessions be made for all people. It was part of the church services early on. You prayed for the lost.
No question.
Secondly, relational evangelism drives it. So their students were equipped with gospel urgency, fluency, and some sort of strategy to share the gospel.
You said those in part of your talk was urgency,
fluency, and strategy.
So just go through those quickly, because if I could just be blunt, that's a student ministry strategy, but that's a church strategy too.
It is a church strategy. So urgency is why should I risk my social equity to share the gospel?
Because we talk about students, but we're just 3 floors down from where the Chuck Colson stuff is here at Wheaton College. And Chuck Colson talked about the cocktail party pressure. So you're expending social equity as an adult sharing the gospel.
Exactly.
And there's a cocktail party pressure. We can talk about those things among polite company.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
So, why should I do
Gospel
this?
urgency.
And gospel fluency is what is the gospel? If you do an interview of the average churchgoer and say, explain the gospel to me, it's going to be like a Texas Stier, a point here, a point there, a lot of bull in between. It's not going to be clear.
I'd like to apologize to my listeners who are very traditional for that. But
my last name is Stier. So
well played. That's what
there
you
go.
meant. Yeah,
there you go.
Exactly.
Thirdly is gospel strategy. What is that methodology? And a lot of times we go straight to the methodology.
Right.
We'll use 4 spiritual laws, or use EE, or use life in 6 words, or the 4.
Yeah, those are all evangelism things. Those are unfamiliar.
Yeah,
By the way, for the record, If you'll use any of them, we're for you using any of them. Right,
Exactly. But before we get there, we need to give the urgency, the fluency. They need to understand the gospel, and then whatever strategy you use will work.
Right.
As long as it's
If
clear.
you have the fluency and the urgency, whatever strategy is going to be effective in that context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the illustration I use is when I go into a steak restaurant, I don't go for the plate, I go for the steak.
There you go.
You know, and the gospel is the steak.
Right.
The methodology is the plate. So
Right.
pick a plate and serve the
Serve
steak,
that
and
steak, right.
it'll be fine. And the third, I won't go through all the values, but the third value I think is really, really important for this audience, youth leaders and church
Right.
leaders.
There's all church leaders here, but certainly youth leaders as well.
So what I would say is this, is the third value is leaders fully embrace and model it. So if you're a church leader and you are not personally sharing the gospel, then your people aren't going to share the gospel. You know, if your people aren't sharing the gospel, you don't need a bullhorn, you need a mirror. Because Jesus said in Luke, no student is above their teacher, but when they're fully trained, they'll be like their teacher. So the question I ask church leaders is this, is if all your people shared the gospel like you do, would your city be reached for Christ by now? And I think a lot of the problems is we as leaders, as pastors, don't personally engage our neighbors, family, and friends in relational evangelism.
If let me give you a pithy phrase. It sounds like something John Maxwell would come up with, but it's so true in evangelism. You can't lead what you won't live. And so for me, with my team, when we would gather together for staff meetings, I would ask. COVID changed a lot of this, but I would ask, who have you shared the gospel with in the last week?
Yep.
And I learned that you would never know Richard Harris, but he was my vice president when I was at the North American Mission Board. He'd come into this room. There were 20 of us that said, who have you shared the gospel with this week?
Yep.
And sometimes he'd call on us.
Yeah.
And I sought to create in my life, and I want to encourage those who are listening to do in their life. You know, I have a regular habit of prayer. I have a regular habit of Bible study. Call them spiritual disciplines.
Yep.
Evangelism is a spiritual discipline as well. And I ask the Lord's grace so that once a week I might be able to share the gospel outside of a local church setting with somebody. And it got hard during COVID because all of a sudden these relationships, everyone's behind a mask or social distance. But I don't, depending upon where you are, and I recognize we don't know exactly where things will be when this podcast releases, but it's a lot easier now than it was a year and a half ago.
Yep.
And so make that part of your spiritual disciplines as well.
And I would say this, I think COVID has actually helped evangelism in a sense. I was talking to Louis Giglio, and
Just drop that in there.
We were doing a podcast together, and I just thought
he's not. He said no to my podcast.
Oh, really?
He's good to me. Actually, I don't think I asked him, which now I feel guilty because he's probably listening every week.
So Louis,
I should say
yes to Ed.
I had his friend Danny Stanley on. So
but I asked him the question because he does the Passion Conference. I go, have you found the college age students more open? He goes, more than ever before.
Fascinating. Okay.
And he goes,
we had Matt Chandler on, and he said the same thing on the podcast.
You know, and it hit me, and I said, I think it is. When I was a pastor and I did a funeral, and you know this as pastors, when you do a funeral, people are more open to the gospel.
Sure.
Because they're not just thinking about the loss of that person; they're thinking about their own mortality. I think COVID has been like a global funeral service. And I think young people and old people are thinking about death because everybody knows somebody who died. And they're thinking about their own mortality, which is a perfect entree into talking about the hope we have now and the hope we have forever through Jesus Christ.
I don't often disagree with my guests. I'm not 100% sure you're right because I think simultaneously so much of our evangelism took place for people who were loosely connected to the church. Those people show up Christmas, Easter, 5, 7, 9 times a year, and I think most of those people have disconnected. So I think secular people maybe are more open, but those nominal Christians, I'm concerned, have disconnected. So it's going to be interesting how it washes out. I want you to be right, and I hear more people saying that than not, so you may be right. I'm statistically suspicious.
I'm practically not suspicious because I was on a plane last night with a lady named Stephanie who something traumatic happened to her. I think somebody close to her may have passed, and she opened up. She was a secular Jew. She opened up her life for 2 hours. From Tampa to here. We talked.
I'm thinking
for her.
I'm
She's
hearing
this
many
close to
people saying the same thing. And, I'm just a stats guy, so I want to see it. But our stats are all useless right now because all the surveys, they're often done face-to-face. Everything changed, so we got about 2 years to figure that out. But I want that to be true. But here's what we both know is true, is that if we can elevate a focus on evangelism, but it seems to me that, I lead the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, right?
Yeah.
You're Dare to Share. For those of you, did I say? I think I said that at the beginning because we jumped right in. But Dare to Share is Greg's ministry. and really global ministry, just doing incredible things. And you can find out more. Just go to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast links, and you'll go right to Dare to Share. But we're both sometimes, this is what part of what we talked about a few years ago. It's kind of like 30 years ago, this very building used to be filled for weeks with Billy Graham schools of evangelism. And they had funding and they paid for people to go and all kinds of stuff. And I get it. But I wrote an article a few years ago, where have all the evangelism conferences gone? Yeah. And you have been a faithful, steady voice. And sometimes I feel like you, me, and a handful of others, where everyone else is, and I get it, there are other important things.
Sure.
But how do we make sure we don't lose a focus on the gospel in our churches? Because these are church leaders. So take it up from the student ministry to the church as a whole. How do we make evangelism a priority again?
Well, let me just make something really clear. I think a simple way to do that is to start giving the gospel in every talk that you give. When you preach a Sunday morning
talks,
sermon,
whatever it be. Yeah.
March 12, 1989, when we planted Grace Church in Arvada, Colorado, I made a promise. Every week you're going to hear a clear gospel presentation, and anybody that's there is going to have an opportunity, some way to respond. And we now...
Now I want to ask you, though, because when people hear that, they think, come forward invitation, but that's not what you meant.
No, there's different ways to do that. Filling out cards, you could do the come forward illustration, you could do bowed head. My preferred way was bow your head, close your eyes, raise your hand, get eye contact afterward. We're going to follow up with you. There's different ways to do that, but some way for people to respond. And people are like, well, the Bible never has an invitation. I go, the Bible always has an invitation. It's come to the water. Their walk forward was to the water, literally, just come into the water right then. So there was a response time. And give those people a response. Here's what happened at Grace.
Grace is the church of
Grace Church is the Grace Church in Arvada, Colorado. Every week, people came to Christ. I remember 2 weeks as a pastor where nobody came to Christ back to back. And the elders gathered us in a circle and said, the sin of Achan must be in the camp because nobody trusted Christ in the last 2 weeks.
Wow. People got to Google a sin of Achan if they don't know
that. That's right.
Yeah.
They're church leaders. They know
that's true. They all know that.
But 20 years,
Maybe.
I've been out of the church for 20 years. The church is a good-sized church now, several thousand. But here's the stat. 62% of the people in that church came to Christ from people reaching people or people inviting out to church, which is outstanding because the gospel to this day is given clearly. So a simple hack is...
Hack. That'll be the people at Outreach who do this, they're going to say, here's a hack, because they love that kind of stuff.
Here's a hack.
Here's a hack. What's the hack?
Whatever passage you're preaching on in Scripture, dig your hand into the dirt and find the Old Testament and New Testament, that scarlet cord. There is a cord that you can pull up and follow it to the cross of Christ. Make a salvation segue and give the gospel every week. And let your people know, every week, I'm going to give the gospel no matter what. And anytime you bring somebody here that doesn't know Christ, they're going to hear the gospel clearly. Then you challenge them. Take their friends out to lunch afterward, and they ask, what did you think about what the pastor said?
So good.
And they can do the follow-up. That's what we did at Grace Church. We called it the reverse altar call because the real ministry would happen at lunch after church when they invited their friends out.
Sure. And let me just say that I'm kind of with him on this. So if you're listening to the podcast, and I don't think most people don't listen to me preach. I preach at different churches, and when I'm a guest, it's a little different. Yeah. But when I have the privilege of being an interim or consistently preaching, and it's not out of the zone of where they are, when I'm the pastor, that's where I go.
Yeah.
And I use the term a little differently, scarlet cord, but I'd point to Spurgeon. Make a beeline to the cross.
Make a beeline to the cross.
And it doesn't have to be, you said it's a salvation segue.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be awkward.
Yeah.
But when I'm in Proverbs, I would say, listen, if you're not a follower of Jesus, these could just be pithy sayings about how you live your life.
That's right.
But if you're a follower of Jesus, you have the power to live what it means to be a follower of Christ. So if you're not, let me tell you how to be. And it doesn't have to be 10 minutes of the message.
No, it's just a few minutes at the end. And also, here's another quick hack.
Hacks.
When you start doing this,
when you're going to Jessica, who's our producer, she's going to love the tweets. Hacks.
There you go.
Hacks from Greg Stier.
The tendency is for people to start putting their stuff away because they know you're giving the gospel.
To zip that Bible. Yeah. Bible zippers should be banned.
That's right. So once a month, you say, hey, everybody putting your stuff away, stop putting your stuff away right now because we're in a battle with Satan for the souls of people in here that don't yet know Christ. So keep your eyes open and pray for the people around you who don't know Christ. You do that once a month or once every 6 weeks. What happened at Grace was they entered in to spiritual warfare for the souls. They started praying for the people in that room that did not yet know Christ. So when they heard the God bless you for hands going up,
Yeah.
they were part of that because they were the heir
They don't know
support.
what you're talking about. So everyone, like Presbyterians are like, what are you talking about? God bless you. God bless you.
Oh
God
yeah,
bless you.
so I did the bowed head, closed
This
eyes.
is-
If you're
was
trusting
your-
in
was your
Jesus,
church a
raise,
Baptist church? 'Cause
raise
it
your
sounds
hand
like
right
it was
now.
a Baptist
It was
church.
kind of a non-denom.
Yeah, okay,
yeah.
But so when people pray, you ask them to raise their hand, and they say, God
Yeah.
bless you, which
God
indicates
bless
you
you.
see them.
They didn't sneeze.
Not everyone does that.
That's
So
right,
that's
that's
the
right.
part. You gotta,
Yeah.
you
I got to
translate
let me
across.
translate. Sorry,
We have a
Mike.
broad audience
That's right.
here.
That's right.
No, I love that.
Episcopalian,
I love-
charismatic.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
talking to
You're
you.
just a little focused on
That's
the
right.
because I came to
I
Christ.
love the thought of it.
The
I'm just
charismatic Episcopal Church. It's not as big as it used to be. When
Yeah.
in the when the 70s and 80s, it was kind of a big thing. Now it's mostly in Anglicanism rather than the Episcopal Church. But that's another story for another day.
yeah.
Last thought. We got to wrap up the podcast. Give just a closing exhortation to pastors and church leaders about making evangelism a priority in their personal lives, so it's reflected in their church
Yeah.
ministry.
Yeah, pastors, I would just really challenge you. Maybe go off campus. Maybe study at a Starbucks. That's what I do. Be around, join a gym, be with people, build relationships, and leave those Jesus breadcrumbs right away in that conversation. And they'll know you're a believer. Maybe let them know you're a pastor. Ask them what they do. They're going to ask you what you do, and you can share. And right away they know. And then maybe even ask them, hey, is there any way I can be praying for you? And that can lead to so many great conversations. Pray every day, God, give me an opportunity today to share the good news with somebody. And that's a prayer that God loves to answer. So go for it. If you need help, I mean, we're Dare to Share. And we're like Liam Neeson and Taken. We have a very particular set of skills, and we will help you. We will look for you, we will find you, and we will gospelize you. We will help you do that and help your people do that as well.
Love that. Greg Stier from Dare to Share. Let me also mention that Greg has written a book by that title, Dare to Share, a field guide to sharing your faith that's applicable for everybody. And also the book I mentioned at the beginning is Unlikely Fighter, the story of how a fatherless street kid overcame violence, chaos, and confusion to become a radical Christ follower. Greg, I'm supposed to mention, though, the yell at me. Make sure you like and share wherever you download your podcasts. And we appreciate you so much for taking the time to listen. Thanks, Greg, for being our guest.
Thanks, Ed.